think it's 9 o'clock, and I think the microphone's been switched on. Excuse me. So, welcome everyone to the start of this session on environmental impacts of war. I'll actually give a proper introduction to this whole theme at the beginning of one of this afternoon's sessions. So I'll give a bit of a keynote presentation later on about how this session came about. So I won't say very much just now to start this off. We have a amazingly full program of presentations today. In this first session, up till coffee time this morning, we've got probably the most diverse group of presentations, broadly speaking, covering the area of diplomacy, heritage, education, and environmental humanities. The interactions between these things are, I think, going to be absolutely fascinating. So it's really nice that we're able to put these into the same session. We'll have a little bit of time at the end of the session, just before we break for coffee, when we can have a general discussion, trying to bring these things together. And we'll try and time things so that each presentation, there'll be a little bit of time at the end of each one for discussion, a question or two at least anyway. But I think I'm going to not say anything more general about this theme now. As I said, we'll come back to it I think it's at 17:35 this afternoon, for those of us who are still there, and try and put everything into a broader context. But now I think I'm just going to move straight into introducing the first presentation of this morning. This is from Professor Rasmus Bertelsen, and I can just read it down here. His topic is Practical and Other Challenges for Science Diplomacy, Dual-Use Intelligence and Moral Panics. Just to say a little bit about our speaker, Rasmus is Professor of Northern Studies and Barents Chair in Politics at UIT here. He's Danish, grew up in Iceland, so his personal and professional commitment to the High North is easy to see. He studied and worked in research in Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland, the Netherlands, the UK, France, USA, Japan, and Denmark, and UIT. Rasmus has been involved in Sino-Nordic academic relations since 2012 and Norwegian-Russian 2014 to 2022, as well as Track 2 processes on Arctic security. He's much involved in EU science diplomacy research and policy making, and I'm going to hand over to Rasmus now. Thank you, Rasmus. So, do you, okay. That's probably all you need. Yeah. Forward, backward, pointer.
Sure. Thank you. Yes. Good morning, everybody. And first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel. It's a very, very exciting topic of these presentations, and to see these environmental humanities, where I'm talking more about, how to say, not so much physical environmental consequences, but more consequences of conflict for scientific cooperation. So that's what I have named this presentation. So, as mentioned, I have been very involved in especially EU science diplomacy research and science diplomacy policy formulation. As a Danish national, I have been in the steering group of a commission process on formulating an EU science diplomacy framework, and in the core editing team, and that document will come out sometime this year. This may be familiar to many people, that when we talk about science diplomacy, I think it's important to keep a broad view of science, not just STEM, but what in Scandinavian would be called Wissenschaft, or in German Wissenschaft, and to keep in mind that diplomacy is a pursuit of foreign policy. And then we have these three well-known categories of science diplomacy: science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. The term of science diplomacy is a recent term, but it's an old practice going back centuries. If we just look at Cold War, post-Cold War, and today, we can see that science diplomacy closely tracks world order. I think what is characterizing international developments today, it's the shift from the West to the rest. And when we look at this image of world population, where we are reminded that the West is a small minority, maybe 1 billion out of 8 billion of the world, and a rough calculation of power in international politics, and of course shows that the West is powerful because we are rich and we have strong science and technology that we translate into military force. So when the others get richer with better science and technology, power shifts. As mentioned, I've had the opportunity to be engaged in academic cooperation with both China and Russia. And there's a lot of controversy, and there's a lot of controversy and concerns these days. And I think they're very much about these questions of dual use, science and technology, intelligence, academia interference. But in my view, these are practical problems with practical solutions. Whereas I'm much, much more concerned about what I see as moral panics. When we talk about dual use, again, it's easy to say that's something only the others do, especially China. But as a Scandinavian who had the opportunity to study, work in US, UK, France, of course, I'd say that great power science and technology is strategic science and technology, and very often dual use. This is the China-Iceland Arctic Observatory, Northeast Iceland, which receives a lot of controversial attention. This is the instrumentation, these cameras recording northern lights, a riometer field. And then instead of engaging in all kinds of conspiracies, I think it's a question of sitting down with physicists and asking, what can you do with this instrumentation? What can you do with the data generated? And as I say, it's not only the other side who may be doing dual use. This is the research ship of the government of Greenland. I took these pictures in northern Greenland some years ago. It was carrying research groups from some Ivy League universities. I talked to some of these people from these research groups, and their work was funded by the US Navy Office of Naval Research. And I suspect that what they were doing, it sounded to me like it had dual use potential, and I suspect that's why the US Navy was paying for it. Then we have this intelligence academia. Again, is it something only the other side does? I had the opportunity to be a PhD student in Cambridge and a postdoc at Harvard. My college master, Churchill College, Sir John Boyd, he had, for instance, been Deputy Undersecretary for Intelligence and Defense in the Foreign Office. Of course, Richard Dearlove, former director of the MI6, Master of Magdalene College. When I was at Harvard, one of my mentors was Dr. Charles Kogan, former very high-level CIA person. So again, it's not something only the other side does. Of course, here at UIT, we had this story about a Russian intelligence officer using UIT as a cover for a year under false Brazilian identity. And some years ago, Frode Berg, who was not an academic, Norwegian involved in people-to-people collaboration with Russia, who was working for Norwegian intelligence. The Russians blew that operation, and it took Norway 1.5 years to get him home from a prison in Moscow. And significant difference is, of course, that on our side we are much better protected by the rule of law than students, colleagues in countries like China or Russia. I think what I think it's very important to keep in mind that, as I see it, these are practical problems with practical solutions about dual use. It's a question of understanding instrumentation and data, and it's very much a question of information management, correct classification, and then managing access to that information by security clearance. As I said, I'm very involved in EU policy making about science diplomacy, and we love to talk about research security, especially our research security. I raise the question, research security for whom? So with my own experience collaborating in China and Russia, I'm always extremely attentive to the safety of Chinese or Russian students and colleagues. This gentleman was Lao She, one of China's great 20th century authors. In 1966, he gave an interview to some foreigners who they published in a very careless way, and he was driven into suicide by the Red Guards. Yes, my final concern is what I see as moral panics. Moral panics is a social theory concept. The classical example of moral panics are witch hunts. And I think we should be very, very cautious about turning intellectual engagement with the other side from a practical problem with practical solutions to a moral problem, where talking to the other side is seen not as a practical challenge, but a moral problem. And I think we in the West have to be extremely cautious of not looking at exchange or study of the other side as a reward or disengagement as a punishment. Thank you very much for your attention, and well, I can finally say that, and of course, Happy New Year of the Snake. And I will unfortunately have to leave you to go back to the university in a short while, but please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, comments.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. And if you wouldn't mind staying on the platform for a moment longer, we have time for one, conceivably two questions, if they're quick ones, if there are any. There aren't. There is. Yes, please.
How do you see open science, the policy of open science in this respect, Rasmus?
Well, thank you very much. That's, of course, a big question. And I mean, today there's so much concern about comparative advantage, relative advantage, who gets ahead with quantum, artificial intelligence, etc. It's very, very easy to close oneself off. A few years ago, the University of Copenhagen, they've had some conferences. They're called something like Open Science Global Challenge or something like that. And they basically picked up on the argument of the Danish physicist Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr argued during the Second World War and after. Bohr was part of the Manhattan Project. And Bohr, he basically argued that sharing nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union was safer and more stable than trying to keep nuclear secrets from the Soviet Union. And the topic of reflection in Copenhagen was, does Bohr's argument about nuclear knowledge, which I think was quite convincing, does that apply today to, for example, quantum, artificial intelligence, and synthetic biology? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rasmus. Thank you again. So I think very much continuing with the theme of the internationalization of what we're considering. Our next presenter is Ben Ferrari, and he is going to present on Project Tangaroa, International Standards for Management of Potentially Polluting Wrecks. Ben has more than 30 years' experience working at the private and public sector interface, He's led innovation ecosystem development on an international basis, latterly with a focus on low carbon technology and ESG strategy. He's represented the UK as an expert at both the European Commission and Council of Europe and co-founded the award-winning Scape Trust. And Ben, over to you.
Thank you. The clicker is presumably...
That moves forward, that moves backwards, that's the point.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think that was my LinkedIn profile, so ignore it. It bears almost no resemblance to reality. I'm going to move quickly through these slides because my main purpose is to let you know who's in the room from the project, from whom you can get much more interesting information than I can deliver. The most important purpose of Tangaroa is to move away from an emergency response mode of dealing with the environmental impacts of war. It's suboptimal. If you're doing it in response mode, the damage has already been done. Generally speaking, damage which cannot be remediated no matter how much money you spend. It's a fruitless approach to dealing with the environmental impacts of the legacy of war. Our principal instrument for doing that is convening workshops of global experts with a view to working with the IMO and UNESCO to deliver internationally accepted guidelines on optimized assessment and intervention. Our next workshop is in Malta, March the 6th. You are all invited. There is an online participation option. So speak to any of us about that and we'll make sure you have that link. We are supported by Lloyd's Register Foundation. Lydia is here. Lydia, could you make yourself known? Lydia, thank you. Lydia can tell you all about LRF, but one of the interesting aspects of the foundation is it is the only shareholder of Lloyd's Register Class Society, which is the oldest class society in the world. That means when you work with the foundation, you have access to a massive hinterland of contacts in the marine industries. The other fantastic thing about Lloyd's Register Foundation in terms of our project is they are holders of a massive archive of engineering drawings, many of which relate to vessels on the seabed and vessels of concern. They also fund other projects from which we can learn an enormous amount. For example, Engineering X, which is focused on the safe decommissioning of offshore structures. And you hardly need me to explain why there is huge amounts of technology read-through from disposing of an oil platform to dealing with oil on the seabed in a dilapidating structure. We kicked off with a synthesis of what we currently know, Springer Open Access. There will be a volume 2, but you can have a look at this, which contains some very interesting case studies, a very good overview of the current regulatory situation regarding legacy wrecks. And perhaps the biggest take-home from that is that most of the flag states who own the casualties of war currently avail themselves of sovereign immunity with regard to dealing with them. Very much thinking about Erasmus's presentation, so why is the American Coast Guard currently spending money on remediating wrecks in the Pacific? A cynic might argue it's principally to counter Chinese soft power in the region, because they have an obligation to do it, and there is no lasting commitment to doing it. But as of right now, geopolitically, it's convenient to be seen to be active in that region. But the population threatened by these wrecks are in a situation where they cannot rely on that help. They cannot rely on Australia continuing with its commitment to provide ad hoc support. And this is the challenge we face. There is no regulatory framework which compels flag states to remediate these wrecks. We have found the work of Camilla Moore very helpful in structuring our thinking. She sets out a very compelling risk and resilience framework for thinking about the impact of these wrecks. And just as an example of the way it has affected our approach, what Camilla demonstrates is that the threat to the Scottish aquaculture industry does not come from single charismatic, well-known wrecks. It comes from the aggregate pollution from a large number of unknown, undocumented, and therefore totally unmanaged wrecks in these waters. And that is something we can extrapolate to other regions. But Camilla's work got us thinking, because our starting point was the Pacific, for obvious reasons. It's one of the best known, most densely populated naval battlefields. But what we realized is when you start thinking about the risk resilience framework, other regions are at least as important as the Pacific in terms of dealing with this legacy. And that brought us to the Arctic. Lloyd's Register is already working with the University of the Arctic on a very interesting program about the history of Arctic safety. We will be working with the University of the Arctic in developing our work in this region, because they can bring to bear a network of expertise. They can bring to bear the kind of engagement with policymakers and change makers in this region that we really need. But I am here to say, we want to hear from you about what our next steps in the Arctic should be. We need to understand rates of change. On your seats, you saw that postcard. That is this vessel on the seabed. 2014, 2021, Stuart?
2022.
22. You can see the rate of dilapidation over a very short space of time. We are seeing this replicated in many parts of the world. We are entering a decade of severely heightened risk of catastrophic collapse and catastrophic release of oil and indeed UXO and other chemicals. Stuart from Waves. Stuart, please wave. What Waves bring to this project is huge expertise in digital modeling. This is their project in Bikini Atoll with Major Projects Foundation, primarily looking at how you can understand internal volumes of dilapidating vessels and therefore come to some assessment of the amount of oil you have to deal with. We're finding out that our stakeholders may have different priorities. We talk about oil removal, but what's fascinating is that our conversations now almost always start with oil transport and disposal. We celebrate some projects in the Pacific which resulted in large amounts of oil being taken out of US vessels. It turns out that that oil is now sitting in a warehouse on that Pacific island with no plans for management, no plans and no capacity for disposal. This really matters. Equally, we do know how to get oil off of wrecks, thank you. But with dilapidating structures, those techniques are becoming less and less relevant. Satellite surveillance is going to be critical. It is showing us that natural phenomena like earthquakes are responsible for accelerated release of oil. The same is true of climate-related storm surges. Jessica and Giles from MAST, they have been incredibly important in bringing to our attention the role of illegal salvage in release of oil and pollutants from wrecks. An example from the Arctic. Jessica and Giles can tell you a lot more about that. We have recently become more aware of a case study in Brazil with a very similar hinterland to it, and indeed fatalities have resulted from the debris that has reached the beach on the prime tourist beaches of Brazil. We know we have not done enough work with impacted communities. Fisherfolk will suffer first, but they can also be part of the monitoring and condition response framework for dealing with these wrecks. And we want to make use of some of the projects that Lloyd's are already funding around fisher safety to see if we can develop a more symbiotic relationship with these communities. There's great work being done. The UK government funded a project around marine response, premium standards around environmental survey, just about to be re-released with revisions specifically for Arctic applications. So CFAS would be very interested in talking about how to project some of this work into this region. But in the end, how are we going to pay for this? And part of my response is, well, we hear so much about blue finance, the blue economy, blue bonds. And yet, PPWs are not seen as a risk factor in assessment of those investments. It's madness. How can you contemplate spending $1 billion on renovating marshland if in the contiguous sea area you've got 1, 2, 3 of these wrecks? It makes no sense. We have to get the profile of the legacy of war higher on the risk register of people contemplating blue investments. It's only common sense. In any land-based investment, it wouldn't even be a discussion. So our colleague Suzanne Johnson is currently working with UNGC on various blue finance initiatives. We need to raise the visibility of this issue in those initiatives. Finally, how can we help? There's great work going on. We are planning phase 2 of Tangaroa. We want to know how we can work with you to deliver more impact in the Arctic. I hope you've seen some of what we can bring in terms of resources, knowledge base, current activities. But we also know we can't be effective unless we're working with partners who can deliver really true insight to the specific problems in specific regions, and that's where we look to you. So thank you very much, and please come and talk to us. We're certainly going to come and find you to talk to you, and I'd be happy to answer a question if there is one.
Thank you so much, Ben. In fact, I think we'll move straight on to the next presentation to keep to time, but that was fantastically useful. Thank you. Our third presentation, which we'll move straight on to now, is from Stephen Wickler, who's going to talk to us about I'll just say the title, shall I? Balancing the Concerns of Cultural Heritage Management and Environmental Threats for World War II Shipwrecks in Arctic Norway. Stephen is a researcher at the Arctic University Museum of Norway here at UIT. I will cut the introduction short to that point, Stephen, and hand over to you. Thank you. Oh, I'll show you the equipment. Forward, backward, pointer. Great.
I'm going to be moving more from the general to the specific here with technology. Love it or leave it. Anyway, I've just picked out a couple of case studies or examples that I've dealt with that represent some of these challenges that we have to deal with on a daily basis between management and preservation of submerged cultural heritage and things like development, pollutants, and so forth. There's many different challenges, not just toxic waste. There's all kinds of things involved. So I want to start with looking at two specific German wrecks, the Tirpitz and Blücher, and how they reflect some of these issues and the need to balance heritage management with things like development. Both of these were owned by a company called Saga Shipping, who owned almost all of the German wrecks in Norway, and they were given this ownership by the Norwegian state right after the war. So the last talk was talking about get to the owners of the wrecks and get them to respond. Well, we've been trying to do that since the war with Saga Shipping, so good luck. That's all I can say. They're not easy to approach or contact. Anyway, this was a dual nomination for both Blücher and Tirpitz that the Directorate for Cultural Heritage enacted in 2016 and was since dropped for Tirpitz. I'll go into that in a bit more detail, but it's still active for Blücher. The second topic I want to talk about briefly is looking at some of the protected war wrecks in Narvik Harbor. there's a huge quantity because of the battles that took place there right after the German invasion, and looking at two specific ships that are both Norwegian, the Norge and Eidsvoll, and what their situation is today. And then lastly, just some brief comments on a recent project we had looking at Russian war wrecks in eastern Finnmark in connection with bridge development with the road authority. So starting with Tirpitz, there's going to be a number of other talks on Tirpitz and the project we have ongoing later, so I won't go into much detail on this, but as most people know, this was a German battleship that was sunk near Tromsø in 1944 by the Allies, by the British, and then it was salvaged over many years from 47 to 58 by this company that I mentioned, Shaga Shipping. And it was given temporary protected status in 2014, but this was dropped in 2016 when the Norwegian state found out that they actually owned the wreck and it wasn't Saga Shipping. So suddenly they weren't so eager to protect it. It's interesting. That's ironic, I think, in a way. And then we have this project that we started up looking at using cutting-edge survey monitoring and analytical tools to look at how this wreck can be used as an example of how we can interact between these two communities of heritage management and development. So as kind of an example of that. Turning to Blueshed, it's in the entrance to Oslo Fjord. It's a very well-known wreck, and it exceptionally good preservation, as you can see from some of these photos. I mean, dramatically good because of the depth and lack of oxygen. So it's an exceptional wreck in many ways. And this cruiser was sunk on the initial German invasion because they made a number of mistakes. And it was sunk by the shore batteries and torpedoes from this outdated fortress of Oskarborg. So it was like the last hurrah of the Norwegians, and after they sunk that, the Germans took over. So it was like, the little guy, like actually destroying one of the German invading battleships. So it's very well known by Norwegians, and it has a lot of symbolic value. We're talking about removal of oil. This was done in 1991, but given the depth, it's from 50 to 90 meters. It was a bit of a challenge back then, but now it's easily accessible to most recreational divers with, mixed gas and rebreathers and so on. So it's no longer off limits to recreational divers at all. But it is, since it is protected, this is administrated by the Norwegian Maritime Museum. They do quite a good job of monitoring who has access to it. And there's a large crack in the hull, you can see, and that will have dramatic consequences for the integrity of the hull. Probably in the next few years, the whole hull could disintegrate, really. And given the amount of material there that's so well preserved, that's a big issue for heritage management. There's plans afoot now and actively bringing up a lot of this material, especially organic remains, paper, photographs, all of this memorabilia, and it will be part of a new exhibition at the museum at the fortress. And this museum is run by the Department of Defense. So it's an interesting interaction, a German ship that's being taken care of by the military in Norway. And it's quite striking. I think they're doing a very good job. And anyway, it's an example of that kind of multinational or, interaction in terms of war wrecks, which is very important, I think. Turning to Narvik, here's just a map of the harbor, and as you can see, there's 21 war wrecks right in the immediate harbor area, and 5 of these vessels are protected by law, and that means they're over 100 years old. And that includes the 2 Norwegian vessels, Norge and Eidsvoll. And there's been active removal of oil over a number of years by various agencies of the Norwegian government. But the challenges are increasing dramatically with, this has become a cruise ship turnaround point, and the number of iron ore freighters has increased dramatically. So it's only a matter of time before there's some significant damage done by impacts, there's going to be collisions, definitely. So there's a lot of issues to think about. And I'm looking at two of these vessels, Norge and Eidsvoll. They were outdated coastal defense vessels. I mean, they were really obsolete. And they were in the harbor to protect the harbor when the Germans arrived. And they were both sunk in a matter of minutes and went straight to the bottom along with many of their crew members. So this was quite a tragic event. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting behind here. Anyway, both of these wrecks are examples of the value of symbols for the Norwegian population. They symbolize the Norwegian response to the initial German attacks. So they're very valuable in this sense, even though there's very little left of them. And the final issue I want to talk about is this experience we had recently with a number of wrecks that were associated with the Russians coming in when the Germans fled Finnmark at the Russian advance. And then they blew up all the bridges. They burned all the houses as well. So it was the scorched earth policy that was in effect. So the Russians actually came in and rebuilt most of the bridges that the Germans had destroyed. And we have a number of wrecks that we encountered, and now they're building a new bridge, the road authority. So we encountered a number of vessels that had to do with the Russian activity during that period. So here's some multi-beam images of the wrecks. And Norway has so many regulations. This is in a military training area, so they have to have permission from the government, from the military, to do any kind of bottom, seabed sampling or the mapping. So they did it surreptitiously. This company came in and did it, and they secretly gave us the multi-beam images without notifying the military, because it'll be probably 2 more years before they finally do something. And so it just shows the hindrances we have in Norway from the bureaucracy and the government. Government agencies not talking to one another, not communicating to us who are also working for the government. It's a big issue. Let's see. There's a number of wrecks here. And one of the most interesting is a LCV that was built for the U.S. Navy. And to my knowledge, it's the only American-built wreck we have in Finnmark. And I'm pretty sure that this was one of the Lend-Lease vessels that was given to the Russians, and the Russians brought them with them when they invaded northern Norway. So it's kind of an interesting multinational heritage type of material that I think is really worth doing interpretation of, because it represents a very interesting political period within northern Norway, and it links up with the Murmansk convoys as well. So it's a linked issue. So I think not just looking at it as rubbish in the intertidal zone, but looking at it actively as a resource in terms of interpretation of what the consequences of World War II were for northern Norwegians. So thank you. I'm sure I used up my time.
Stephen, yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We won't take any questions to Stephen now, in the interests of keeping roughly to time. But that's opened up a whole new set of perspectives for us to think about. And our next presentation will continue to do that, I think. So, Marta, Sophie, are you both going to speak to this presentation? Okay, so our next presentation let me just find the title, Imaginary Borders, Methods for Engaging Students and Local Community Members. I'm sure we can all see the importance of that. We have two presenters for this, Marta Espirito Santo and Sophie Weeks. And how are you going to do this? Have you got both microphones? Okay, so I will very briefly say that Marta and Sophie are both members of Polar Educators International. They have institutional affiliations as well. Marta is from Portugal, Sophie is from the UK, from the Scott Polar Research Institute. And I'll hand over to you both now.
Thank you.
So do you want to come up on
Yes.
the platform?
Did you push me?
Yes.
You should come up now.
Yes, forward, back, pointer.
Will you do forward back? I can do it.
I can try it.
It's just okay. So, thanks for having some educators here at this very scientific conference. We hope you'll be entertained and intrigued by some of the things we're about to say. My first encounter with tirapits was last year. I gave a very sort of metaphorical and allegorical talk. This is not going to be one of those. So, environmental impacts of war in education. What kind of methodologies can we use for engaging students in these topics that you're talking about? Where is the place of education in both culture and knowledge building and science impact? I don't know what I'm doing. So, this is how we wanted to start. Research planning should include education and engagement for a wider impact and better science. When I say planning, I really mean planning. I don't mean get to the end of a research project and think, let's add a bit of education because it'd be good to do something for the kids. So the education should be embedded. How does science enhance community engagement with environmental impacts of war? That's a question for us, but we're also in our heads is the reverse question. So how does engagement with environmental impacts of war affect your science? So we're looking here at monitoring education-focused approaches and evaluation, and we're going to talk about some key pedagogy based on your research methods and our expertise. And we're going to consider the interrelationship of the Arctic Low goals, research goals, with our practice.
So, we can't talk about education without talking about interdisciplinarity, because our views of the world, it's an interdisciplinary view. So we can split subjects. We can together see and help students to work on the field and to work thinking and reflecting in each one of these subjects, and to explore the curriculum well, and including the impacts of war, not only in school, not only in education, but in society, because students are the future of the society. So the tirapits can be a tool to facilitate imagination and open-ended discussions on historical narratives, environmental issues, and contemporary implications. And it's very important to have immersive fieldwork, to visit historical sites, to visit museums for hands-on learning experiences, interact with artifacts, and hear first-hand accounts from community members. They know. Some of them they lived, some of them they have memories, trauma issues. They need to speak about it, and the students need to learn from them. Situate scientific understanding within Tromsø's war legacies. And then we can use problem-based learning to do it. How? Ask students to make some questions, reflect. Participants develop research inquiries. They want to learn more, and then they plan research. They can plan, design, and execute parallel research activities. Why? Because they need to have conclusions. They need to reach some findings and share the results in different ways. And it's important to have training, accessible strategies for measuring the Arctic environmental impact of war. How can we do that? Using photography, using drone imagery. We saw them here. Why can't we use it with the students? Why can't we put students analyzing those images that you showed here and reflect on them? And use remote sensing. We need to connect participants and understand the environmental changes linked to historical events. They are not separate. They are together, united. History and science.
Thank you. So one more method, which in fact I spoke to some of you about last night, collaborative art making and storytelling. This is not only something that students can do to create a safe space to engage in difficult conversations where there are different points of view and different opinions. It's something you could do too. So maybe advocating involving writers, artists, composers as an extra element of this project can help us have conversations we never thought we should have or never even dreamed we could have. So this is kind of a four-step process, four-step process. So I just mentioned we would, through this kind of collaborative storytelling and art making, you can invite all participants, you and students, to express your understanding, but also your emotions in relation to this culture and environmental legacy of war. So, the thing you're almost scared of, community involvement in current scientific research. It can happen. It can happen if it's planned. It can happen if it's evaluated along the way and managed along the way. And I'm absolutely sure it can strengthen your scientific research to involve these wider communities in your science. Obviously, it would enrich the school curricula. So we described a little bit about the place of education in science and science in education. I hope we've intrigued you. We've talked about the fact that knowledge building is collaborative. It doesn't sit with any one individual person, any one individual research project, or one individual teacher. If you want to explore the impact of your research, we urge you to plan in education and engagement of the local community. So this is what we're proposing for the Tirpitz project. We don't want to we want to think about it as knowledge rebuilding, because knowledge will be reconstructed and reconstructed throughout this process because of the different views of the stakeholders involved. We want there to be a realizable value in the research that you're doing to the community. I'm really sorry about the puns, but I like puns. So, sinking historical contexts. So science is, you're proposing, gaining a deeper understanding of research impact on Tromsø's history, of how past conflicts shape science identities, and diverse local values. That might sound a little bit strange to some of you, that perhaps your science is going to impact the wider community, and the wider community are going to impact your science, but through these projects, but it does happen. Oops. 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 Critical thinking. Many of the techniques that we talked about earlier on are to encourage this kind of deep dive critical thinking. So the more real we can make it for the people that we involve, and this could also be policymakers and decision makers as well as students, the more intriguing and useful and valuable the output will be. Just looking at what I wrote. So obviously we're talking about local history. Neither Marta nor I are local to Tromsø, but we can bring our own perspectives from the UK and from Portugal. And hopefully now you're beginning to recognise the role of both scientific research and education in shaping and reshaping Tromsø's future. We want to embed, obviously, the two of us spend all of our time trying to embed environmental awareness for obvious reasons. We want to include now in curricula, and it isn't in curricula anywhere in schools, but in community settings as well, and environments, include the ecological impacts of war. Think about how that reuse, repair, blah, 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 blah. How is that, what questions does it or doesn't it evoke that you're walking on a bit of the tail pits when you walk around Tromsø, as you heard yesterday? Every person's point of view from wherever culture or place they come will be different and diverse, so we want to make sure, and you should too, that there's a diverse view of environmental sustainability. And there's been a long historical stewardship of both the ocean and the land here in this region, so that we want to make education a part of trying to continue that into the future.
And to finalize?
Yes. Global issues, local there is.
Yeah.
But we do believe it will empower the local community. We do believe that it will strengthen your science, and we do believe that in the model that you're creating, being relevant to a wider community than Tromsø.
Yes.
I think that's it.
That's it.
I can't make it go.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Too long.
Marta, Sophie, thank you both very much indeed. Again, I think we won't take time for questions now, with the aim of sticking more or less to our timetable. From my own personal experience engaging with this organisation, Polar Educators International, I would say that they have a lot to teach us about how we teach and how we engage with our research. So thank you again, both of you. I think we'll move on to the next
Yes, thank you so much.
presentation. But
Sorry to run over.
thank you. So our next presentation is given by Tim Riley. I know Tim too well to be able to give a brief biographical introduction. To my astonishment, he actually was my PhD student at one point, despite the fact that I'm almost completely incapable of supervising anything that Tim knows about. I'll give one line from his biography as Senior Associate Fellow at the Institute for Statecraft in London. He's an Arctic expert. He's lots of other things as well. So Tim is going to broaden our understanding of what the legacies of war might look like considerably by talking about space. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks very much. As we're very short of time, ladies and gentlemen, what I thought I'd do is kind of reverse the process, rather take you through an iterative process and say, here's the conclusions. So that I know you're having so many presentations the next few days, I'm going to give you the 4 bullet points that you may want to walk away with, and the concept that I'm really driving at today. And points that I will now speak about hopefully will fit into one of those 4 categories. The concept of terrestrial life, as in the Arctic, and the concept of the domain of space have quite often been separate. The first thing I would say is to encourage you now to start looking at it as one domain, space and the Arctic, as one intellectual framework by which we can look at the world. And the world now includes this other dimension of space. With the new American administration, Musk and all the rest of it, and this particular country, Norway, in terms of rocket launches and all the rest, I think it'd be very useful in terms of an intellectual framework as how we look at the legacy of war, the methodology of science, and the outputs we're looking now is to begin to think, if you talk about the Arctic, you have to think about space. For those that are policymakers amongst you, the reason I say that is because that is how the Chinese think about it, as we will see. Second point is, what then links the space and the Arctic is technology. And we're going to hear a lot from Gareth's team and other players later today in the legacy of war and in the Turpis example, that a lot of it is very high technology. But a lot of it, increasingly now, is space-based. So you can't get that technology because it's operated from space. So this idea, again, repeat, the framework of the Arctic now needs to include in your thinking what the effect of space will be, how it'll hinder, how it'll help. So the second point, as I say, is the technology. Third point I want to make is, which is the positive thing, which will lead to the fourth point, is really there are enormous benefits from going to space, as we know. Technology is one of the most important ones in terms of it's right at the front here. But we should bear in mind, especially in this country and in the Arctic generally, that the benefits from the space should and must benefit Earth. And this part of the world is a harsh environment, needs all the help it can get scientifically, technologically, policy-wise. So that's my third point. And the fourth point, which is logical from that, is an appeal as an outsider, as a Brit who's not an Arctic country, but we have interests in there historically, is for the Arctic Council must be involved in the next few years with Trump and Musk as policy regulation for space occurs. Because what happens in space will happen in the Arctic. And the Arctic needs to be part of the formation of the next step that we're going forward in space with Musk and the Chinese, because it will directly impact us. So it's an appeal for the Arctic Council to think in this two dimensions now, terrestrial, non-terrestrial, to see how technology is linking it, seeing that the benefits from space can come directly down to some of the challenges we have on Earth, and institutionally, how people involved, policymakers, Arctic Council, representing the Arctic regions, the Arctic region, is more and more involved in what happens in space and how they can actually get involved in institution building there to reflect the importance to the Arctic. So that's really the 4 points, and we'll whip through it, as I say, but quickly here, if I can work the technology. Not so far. Yeah. So some of the challenges: climate frameworks and geopolitics. So this is we've gone into the micro, and now we're going back to the macro. Here's one of the challenges. Under the Obama administration, they considered that the strategic impact of climate change in this part of the world was environmental, and as a result, they had mitigation was the framework that they used in terms of the science, geoengineering, regulation, these sort of things that came in. Chinese looked at this, along with the Russians. The Russians agreed with the Americans that it was about mitigation, but the Chinese said no. The strategic implications of climate change in the Arctic are geopolitical. For example, the NSR is opening up. It's a trade route between East and West because of climate change. That is a geopolitical important thing for us to do. So they came to the conclusion that we don't want to look at a mitigation framework, we want to look at adaptation. Now, a lot of what's going on in the Tirpitz here, Legacy of War, is looking at mitigation. The truth is we need both. But be aware that now what America is doing in very general terms over the Biden administration, you're seeing it already in Trump, they're moving away from a mitigation framework for science and investigation into one of adaptation. Why? Because the Chinese are saying that the driver of this is geopolitical, it's not necessarily environmental. The word to the policy makers here and the scientists here is be very careful, because what this means is between China and America there is the potential that you're going to have the instrumentalization of adaptation and mitigation scientific frameworks, not for environmental benefit, for geopolitical benefits. And we've talked already, Rasmus hinted about dual use technologies. That's where the rubber hits the road and where this can go offline. And this is what we have to be careful about. Chinese have had this quote from a Chinese plan admiral that if we can control space above the Arctic, we can control 2 oceans and 3 continents, northern hemisphere. So there's already a view in terms of the science endeavors that we have and what they're doing in space. Actually, they're looking at the governance of this region, which is a direct challenge to the Arctic Council, which of course is a terrestrially based forum. And they're saying, well, if we have IoT, big data, robotics, AI and all the rest of it, we can begin to talk about the idea of governing from space, undercutting terrestrial governance of things like the Arctic Council. Arctic and space classifications. To that end, China, as we've all heard, the heritage of all mankind, we talk about the deep sea, the deep land, deep space, cyber. China is now including the poles. Why is this dangerous in terms of the framework through which we try and understand this world here? Is that blurring means that the areas of heritage of all mankind are classified as areas where there is no national jurisdiction. So you're saying, actually, deep space, nobody controls deep space. Deep oceans, cyber, no one controls this. It's beyond any one nation. And if you add the poles in there, suddenly China has as much right in this area as anybody else, because it's the heritage of all mankind. So this is Greenland, what's happening with Trump, some of the space moves that are being made, Sino-Russian Arctic Council. This is what's behind this. But it affects directly what sort of science you do. Adaptation, mitigation, whether you work with the Chinese, geopolitical implications of the instrumentalization of science that goes in a direction that you as scientists and policy people may not agree. And the Arctic knowledge, so what we're getting through China using space and through technology beamed down from space is that the knowledge base that we have here of Nordic countries, North America, the knowledge about the science of this part of the world is moving to China because they have got massive big data coming from space itself. So those things are there. The strategic competition, therefore, making the environment more difficult because we have NATO there, we have geopolitical regions and spheres of interest gathering up. So what could we say? Geoengineering in terms of mitigation, solar panels, all this is space-based, nuke fusion. This is the bit about the benefit coming back down into the Nordic, into the Arctic region. That's what we want to look at. We're looking at the International Telecoms Union, establishing parking slots for satellites in space, frequency allocation, so that actually that can get down, which is very important because of the big data there. A lot of AI is being actually, analysis of big data is taking place in space because there's not a bandwidth to bring the information back down to this part of the world. So you're doing the analysis there, and therefore, in this way, China, especially leading this, is they're beginning to move the knowledge base into this region. And what this does is it gives them a voice. So let's leave that as a Russian example. This is the final slide. This is what we do. This is the bottom line. What I really have been saying about this is the Arctic Council must involve itself in space because China and to some extent Russia are blurring the two. The Northern Sea route, as you've all heard of, for instance, the Americans' view on that, which they're listening to the Chinese, is that is just one huge digitized platform for ventures into space. Nothing to do with the Arctic in that sense. So we must be involved in this. We looked, and some of the stuff that we're doing, the legacy of war, is about confidence-building measures. And what is happening now in this 21st century is China and Russia and the United States, there's new spheres of interest. And that means they're carving out. One is the Arctic, they want to dominate, and the other is space. So confidence-building measures, like the projects we're talking here in the legacy of war, is how we actually maintain some peace and stability between the three superpowers. We have the former, the present, and the future superpowers all in this country right now. So it's a very difficult time to do good science without interference for political reasons. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, again, I think we won't take questions now in order to keep the timetable more or less there. But, well, what can I say, Tim? You've given us a lot more to think about, too. The last part of this pre-coffee session we'll do in a slightly different way. So we have three presenters, but I think it would be accurate to say one presentation. I'm getting some nods, so that's encouraging me to think I'm saying the right thing. Environmental humanities perspectives on geopolitics and war is the topic that's going to be taken for us now. As I say, we have three presenters. Lily Mittner, Kate Maxwell, and Ana Luisa Sanchez-Laws. I'll say very briefly, so they're all from UIT here in Tromsø. Lily Mittner is Associate Professor at the Centre for Women's and Gender Research and Scientific Coordinator at the Centre for Arctic Humanities. Kate Maxwell is Professor of Musicology, and Ana Sanchez-Laws is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies. I'll leave the introduction to that and invite the three of you onto the platform. I hope you're all mic'd up or can use this. And I'll give one of you the magic controller. So please come up. Okay. Forwards, backwards, pointer. Don't look at the laser beam.
Thank you very much. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Lily Mittner. I'm the coordinator for the Center for Arctic Humanities. The center collects or combines many different research environments. We have 10 research environments now at UIT, working in humanities, in the Arctic, or about the Arctic. And yeah, we, from the humanities, we often need a lot of time. So that's why I'm happy that we combine our talks, 10 minutes talks, with one presentation for 30 minutes, but probably it won't be 30 minutes either because we are out of time. 30 is okay. Okay, let's 28. Is this the time running here? Somehow? Okay, I will keep time. We go into depth and we work on imaginaries about the Arctic. We work on imaginaries about war and peace. We work on narratives, on stories, how we tell stories, and on relations between people. So I'm very happy that I have Kate Maxwell with me and Anna Sanchez-Lor representing 2 of those environments in the center. And we will talk about our research. Here we go. Yeah, Kate will start with the environmental humanities perspectives, working in a group, in a research group called Environmental Humanities. And I will talk about memoryscapes and meta stories, and I will talk about my research that combines art and science. So, where are we?
Yes, why are we here? I think that in principle is to offer to you the broad view. We have now heard from the whole view of space, Earth, deep sea. We want to take it even further and look at the long line that is the historical line that we have also been discussing. But beyond that, there's a concept from Deleuze and Guattari. It's called lines of flight. And this is where our type of research takes us out of those known frames and brings us to a level that deterritorializes knowledge, in a sense. So that's where we are going. And we find that often research doesn't account for all the complexity of the human experience and how we interact with our planet. And that includes humor, joy, irony, greed, many other emotions and experiences that are often missing in some of this modeling about the futures. So that's why, from our perspective, we are here to tell you about those aspects.
I'm also here representing the UIT Environmental Humanities Research Group, as well as representing the Academy for Music. How those two come together, we'll maybe see in a minute. And when we think about the environmental humanities, we have to think about collaboration. We've heard this again and again today, and also yesterday, is that there's no one way, no one discipline or person or field that can solve the problems facing the world. And if we're working together, that means we need the sensitivity for language. The term science has come up again. We had somebody saying, it was Rasmus, I think, about Wissenschaft and Wissenschaft. And remember that in English, the word science excludes us three. We are researchers. So again, how we talk about things, now we'll talk about excellence a bit more in a later slide. How we talk about things, how we communicate knowledge really makes a difference as to how we can work together. Because if we don't have that mutual understanding, then we're not going to get any further. We're going to be separated at the very beginning. This, of course, is also very important for education. Narratives. Lily, do you want to say something about narratives?
Yes, actually I want to say something about combining research, education and outreach. So something that is very often divided now, that we bring together in our practice as researcher anyway. So we do research when we educate when we do research, and we are always very well connected with the community, because we work with people, with the humans. And the narratives in the past and in the present, in the future, about past, present, future, are probably one of our major concerns. So,
yes, so now we're going on to the three sort of research examples, if you will, and we're starting with a bit of music history to take you through, because art has always been there in times of crisis. Art has been around since humans became Homo sapiens. Even, in fact, the Homo neanderthalis was thought to have song. Music is possibly our first, earliest art. And every time we look at the past, we rewrite it. Every generation rewrites history. And I've picked the example of Carmina Burana because it's going to be performed on Friday at 5 o'clock in the Domkyrka, so just there, in fact. And you can even have a very rare opportunity to hear me sing. I don't do that in public very often, just in the shower. Of course, the thing with rewriting history is that can be for good or for bad, and Carmina Burana is definitely an example of that. This is what's known as the medieval Carmina Burana. Now, I mean, we didn't used to have to call it the medieval Carmina Burana when it was the only Carmina Burana, but the one that you all know is O Fortuna, right? That's the Karl Orff version. That's the next slide. But the medieval version was compiled in round about the 12th century. It also had some additions later on, so it's very difficult to date. No, we need to go back to the medieval version. Sorry. Haven't finished with that yet.
No.
Yep. Here we go. And you can see on the slide that it does actually have musical notation. Not very much, but it does have some. In Orff's time, they hadn't learned how to read that yet, or we hadn't realized how to read that yet. Arguably, we still don't know, but we have a better idea than we did in the 1930s. So, right, now you can go forward. When you come to hear Orff's version on Friday, you will hear 24 of the 254 poems set to music in 1937. Now, I hardly need to tell you much about that date and what it has to do with the rest of that this session and the work that's been going on with World War II here. And, of course, Orff picked these poems carefully. He was employed by the German government at the time, the Nazi government. He was receiving a salary. He was not a member of the Nazi Party. It's a very grey area. In fact, after the war, he was classified as Grey Sea acceptable by the Americans. So we're in a very, very difficult zone here. And it had to be acceptable for the Nazis too. And at first it wasn't. They didn't like it at first, but within a few years it had become an anthem for the regime and one of the favourites that was performed and played on radios and also used in propaganda. Now, when we hear it, we know it probably from computer games, perhaps, or from advertisements. I think it's been used to advertise jeans. You know, everyone knows that opening and indeed the closing number. It's the same number. It's the Wheel of Fortune that goes round. And this is partly its danger. It was actually, I believe, Stalin, and then quoted by Goebbels, so a nice company here, who said if you repeat anything often enough, it becomes the truth. Now, we as educators and researchers really have to remember that, and also the company that we're in. Right. So apart from the fact that this is taking place on Friday, right now, right here, I want to use this to show how collaboration can actually work together. Because as you can see, we have all of these layers of meaning that we've been visiting today. We've got the medieval layer, we have the World War II layer. I missed out the romantic layer of the 19th century just because of time, but there's one of them too that I can tell you about. And that means that concepts and terminology that we take for granted, like excellence, can actually mean something very different in other concepts. And I could talk at least for half an hour about why the concept of excellence that a lot of us take for granted, that funding application committees certainly take for granted, is actually quite harmful in many contexts. The short version is it tends to mean Western white person excellence, not any other kind of excellence. That's the very short version of it. The other thing is that institutions, and especially where the money is concerned, tend to favour low-risk research. They don't like the kind of risky, messy research that is what happens when you start collaborating across disciplinary boundaries. I've been arguing for this for nearly 10 years now. The other thing that is very important to say is that while there are so many people from the humanities in this room that I've met yesterday and over the course of today, which is brilliant, that are willing to work together, we need to get something back too, because we also have to show our bosses that we are not just secretaries and we're not just decoration for other projects, that we have to advance our own disciplines too. But remember that in collaboration, not every discipline has to advance to the same degree. You know, it's quite okay for one to go this far and another one to go that far. That's fine, but there just needs to be some advancement and involvement. With that, I hand over to Anna.
Yes, so another aspect that humanities can contribute with concerns new concepts and new language, and in this we are working on the ideas of memoryscapes and meta-stories. And on the topic of memoryscapes, these are critical spaces where communities and individuals address conflicting pasts. Sometimes memoryscapes promote reconciliation. Other times they fuel agitation, but in essence, memoryscapes function as catalysts to speak not only about the pathways and processes of peace building and war, but also about their materiality. So we have a project entitled Arctic Memoryscapes, and it consists of a multi-level mapping of a series of Arctic sites. And I'm conducting this project with Camilla Bersnip, who is a researcher at NOFIMA, and it's part of my period as the Arctic 6 Chair in Heritage. So we are recording the sounds, visuals, geographies, cultural, physical, historical, political, social, traditional. And we want to move slowly, listen, experience, live in the Arctic as this is now our home. We are newcomers, but at the same time it feels like we have always lived here. The image you see here is from the project last year with a stay in Finnmarksvidda, and I have to say that personally it was in the coldest nights camping out in Finnmarksvidda in the winter that I felt most at peace. And I found that indeed the Arctic had become my home. But that's the subject of a different story. I'm a Norwegian citizen, but I was born in Panama. Strangely enough, the events in parts of the Arctic remind me of memoryscapes from my other home. We are connected by waterways, oceans that defy human borders. So I hope we can capture that in our project. We will be looking at marine protected areas, current and future, in tandem with heritage sites on land as whole ecosystems. These places are interesting because they have often created opportunities for peace. We're going to do the same later this year in the coast from Cambridge Bay in Nunavut to Anchorage in Alaska. And we hope this mapping becomes a resource for peace and shows that strategies small communities are using to resist short-term temptations and to thrive, and offer the idea of meta-stories. These are webs of narratives that ask us to look at ongoing crises as entanglements that demand collective responses leading to justice and to the respect of human rights. In the slide, there are a couple of examples of the products of scenario building. On the right-hand side, the well-known scenarios from the IPCC's 6th assessment report, and on the left, socioeconomic scenarios for the Eurasian Arctic that were presented by researchers from the Finnish Meteorological Institute in a report in 2016. As you can see from their exercise, some possible scenarios for the Arctic include the Wild West, exploited colony, and Antarctic, to name a few. Scenario building, as seen in these examples, has been used for a long time. However, the concept of meta-storytelling includes a couple of novelties that distinguish it from the traditional scenario building approach. For one, it acknowledges, building on the long tradition of humanities research, that while neutrality might seem as a desirable ideal, it mostly remains just that, an ideal, that at times can be impractical and at others plainly immoral. As fields such as indigenous research remind us, acknowledging one's position may be the only viable avenue through which to try to build trust in the scientific project. But of course, we must also say that this is not a strategy immune to manipulation. But to go back to the novelties of meta-storytelling as a concept, it requires the recognition of the role of narrators, their narratives, and their contexts as an intrinsic problem to be addressed as part of scenario building. This requires an examination of the conditions upon which a given scenario is produced, the inequalities and injustices that one may observe during the process. One such injustice may be leaving out those most affected by scenarios from the very process of conceiving these scenarios. Another may be to prioritize storytelling forms that are controlled by dominant groups in society. Another novelty in meta-storytelling is to focus not only on mapping the multiple injustices that may be intentionally or unwittingly committed during the act of scenario building, but also creating methods to tackle those injustices. In that sense, meta-storytelling demands that the researcher goes beyond the neutral fact-checker role. This is not meant to try to force the scientist to adopt any given political leaning, but to champion new perspectives, bridges across divides, a stewardship role instead of an observer role, a role in which the researchers consistently remind themselves, I'm part of this, whether I like it or not. None of this is new. This is what humanities has been about for decades. What we don't know is how aware other fields are of this kind of work. If the case is yes, we all acknowledge the positionality and reflexivity, the potential of interpretive perspectives to contribute to better forecasting and scenario building, and we are doing all of it already, then meta-storytelling has not much new to offer to the enterprise of creating new visions of the Arctic. If, on the contrary, it becomes evident after this talk that not much of this critique is being incorporated in current practice, we would love to be part of fixing this problem. So here is one example of meta-stories of the Arctic, entitled The Garden of Arctic Dreams. I have traced 4 storylines that I have experienced during my time here. In one line of flight, the Arctic is a place of adventure, of exploration, of exploitation, of lies and manipulation, of stratagems that end up in a theater of war. In another line of flight, the Arctic is this great unknown, hiding the deepest secret treasures at the bottom of its sea and underneath its ice sheets. This is the place for a new gold rush. In a third line of flight, the idea of the Arctic as containing a mare nullius that is up for grabs is abandoned in favor of a model that allows for continued peaceful collaboration, as humanity has managed to do both here and in the other pole so far. In the fourth line of flight, the one closest to my heart, the Arctic is a home, and is recognized as the heritage of humans and non-human livings, all alike. So where do these 4 lines of flight leave us? I know it's misleading to separate them in this way, but this is what art sometimes must do to reveal the gaps so that we can address them. Where do these lines converge in the future? Do they become orthogonal? Do they create the garden of forking paths that Jorge Luis Borges so well described? A true entanglement? For humanities, the contribution is to show the immense power of human imagination and creativity, to share new language and new concepts, though perhaps these are old concepts and old language that must live on, to see the new in the old in the new, to show that which is forever, to show that we should have never been, to see, hear, and feel the long lines, to repeat that we will not be here so long, so what should we leave behind?
So what unites us is what we call for the feminist posthuman approach, which puts the human in a new position. So what it means to be human when we do research, when we live, when we care for nature and other people, has to be questions. And this approach, or this kind of theoretical lenses, helps us to ask different questions and to see different things. And I think this is very important when we do research on war and when we do research on environment, because what is environment? Does it include the human? Is it about space and seabed? How broad are we thinking when we think nature? And who asks the question, who tells the stories, which stories are told, are very fundamental question asked by very pronouncedly asked by a feminist scholar, Donna Haraway, but also others who constantly have to ask when we write applications, when we write research papers, when we go into interaction with other researchers, why do we want to know this? Who wants to know this? How should we know it? Who should do the work? So this picture is from educational boat trip here on the Balsfjord, where I was invited as a humanities scholar together with the fishery department. And what they did, so I have no clue of fisheries. They go to the seabed and scrap on the seabed. I guess it's something similar that you go with the drone underwater and see what is there, because we very often don't know. And then they sort the materials and classify and count, as scientists used to do. But as an artist and scholars from humanities, I was asked, what do you see? So how would you sort those materials we get from the ground? And I see different things. I see colors, I see shapes, I see sensorial material, and grouped it in different ways as the others in the group. And this sparked a lot of discussions between us. So what is it that we want to know? How do we want to know? And this was this educational project also that was not only with society, but was between researchers who very often don't communicate about fundamental questions. What do we want to know and how do we want to know it together? So, yeah. The other thing I would like to highlight is this collaboration between art and science. So there was this talk on Monday from an exhibition we made together with a research group that is connected to the Center for Arctic Humanities, working on the future of the ocean and the role of the human in this future. And we had to find out together how we would like to communicate scientific knowledge. How do we want to communicate research knowledge? How we communicate different disciplines that work on coastal cultures and work on the ocean. And our way to do this was to combine a picture with a question that we displayed in an exhibition, an outdoor exhibition that is now traveling around the world, which is a way for us to make people think differently, to communicate research, but also to combine art and science in new ways, to think together really, what is a good question, what kind of picture should we use, how are we going to interact with ourselves and with society. So it's a co-learning process. I think that's very important here. And again, in addition to co-learning, probably on an even broader level, is the co-creativity that is very central to our work, that we create something together, that we are here. So just together, so it's not each of us representing a discipline or a field, but we try to combine our different practices as researchers, and already in the preparation for this happened so much things that we will take back to our research. So I think to work together, to collaborate across the humanities, into the interdisciplinary humanities, but also across the so-called shape fields and the STEM fields is very important, and we have to find out how to do this, because 100 years ago, it was very common that researchers did a bit of everything. So researchers very often also were artists. They were drawing, they were writing, they were doing art, used creative methods to find knowledge, to find solutions. But in this search for excellence, probably, but also in the way of becoming even more professional at universities, those knowledge fields were separated. And bringing it together again with not in one person necessarily, but as a group, is something, a way we think we should go. And then the question is, how can we do this on the premises of the arts and humanities? Because what Kate also mentioned is that very often we are invited into a research project as something beautiful, or okay, this is the outreach, this is the educational part. But I think to come with this kind of knowledge we develop from the very beginning in research design is very, very important. So this picture, I would like to ask you actually what you see here. And I give you a background. It's from a book project about water and people from Sri Lanka. And in Sri Lanka, it's also a coastal community driven by fisheries and tourism, similar to northern Norway. I guess there are many shipwrecks there. I don't know. You may know. What do you see? Just shout out. Shout in. A very clean beach, yeah. Have you been in Sri Lanka? Yeah, because normally there are a lot of dogs, and I think there are dogs over here. Yeah, some clean beach. Something else? Waves, yeah. Someone's going for a walk, yeah. So I see music in the sand. And this is because of my background. And I think that's so important when we communicate pictures, as we did in this exhibition. Everyone sees different things, and we have to keep this in mind when we create knowledge. So now I will stop to summarize.
So just going back to some of the points that we have tried to exemplify through our talk, we can contribute with new theoretical perspectives, concept development, also with focusing on the consequences, on the impact of things, thinking about novel questions, absurd questions sometimes, disturbing questions sometimes, but they need to be asked as well. And perhaps through that, working to establish more trust in the scientific enterprise, if we are going to continue calling it that way, embracing all kinds of knowledge, understanding that we are just part of a bigger project, and therefore situating ourselves in the everyday life and experiences of the places we live in.
One thing we do have to say, though, is that this kind of work and this kind of impact is very difficult to measure. And I'm going to go back to the example of Nordlysfestivalen, of which Carmina Burano is a part. It involves not just the university and professional musicians, but it also involves about 40 singers from local choirs. They take that knowledge and move it on. It involves teachers from local schools. This is a very clear way to impact. We've talked, that slide you saw, I've talked to them about it. They've heard that part of this talk. And this ripple effect then goes out into the community in different ways, and people think about things, but it's very, very difficult to measure that. I have a lovely model in that publication, which will give you a QR code for, which you can use. It proposes a method to measure the impact, or the long-term impact, of ripple effect consequences and influences. So, our final ending.
Our final questions for reflections. I'm not going to read them. You have to go to YouTube and watch the recording of this talk and press on stop. But I think it's so important. Nearly each time, every day I woke up and I have my children in the breakfast, and then I ask, what are you doing today? And this is what I'm asking me every day, why I'm doing this. I think each of us should do this. So it's about ethical consequences, it's about the role of the human, and it's about the institutional structures we are part of, and that so much steer what we do, how we do it, why we do it. So here are the QR codes. Listen to the playlist to this talk, and here are the link for further readings. It's our own research, it are the books we mentioned and the papers, and come to us and ask. Thank you very much.
The playlist is fantastic.
Anna Luisa, Lily, Kate, that was a, oh yeah, don't forget your phone or your notes. That was a great way to finish this morning's session. I don't think a panel discussion now, which we kind of nominally built some time in to do, makes a huge amount of sense, given the time that we've reached, and given the diversity of perspectives and new frameworks that we've heard about this morning. I think it's probably time for us to break for coffee anyway, but I hope that some conversations right now will be initiated by what we've heard here. So can we thank all the presenters from, I should say, the next part of this environmental impacts of war session, so we'll call this a sub-session that we've just had, is not immediately after coffee, but it's first thing after lunch. I'm looking, Brian's nodding, I've said it right. Good. So we have some time off, maybe to reflect on what we've heard this morning, and then we can reconvene at, I think it's 1:15 in this, 1 o'clock. Probably 1 o'clock. Check your programs. I don't know. I should know these things. But could we thank all of the presenters from this morning's session?